This is methodology. The initial contact and 3 callbacks were required before designated respondent could be dropped and substitute. More than 70 of initially designated respondents completed the survey. 20% of interviewers were validated for control purposes. A typology of basic attitudes toward animals and nature, previously used in the American and German studies, was employed in this Japanese investigation. Okay, let's start nearly near the results of a study. Brief definition of the attitude types are indicated in the table, which I will read, although more detailed description available in some published papers. Questionnaire scales were developed to measure most of the attitude types based on cluster analysis. The scales consisted of statistically independent clusters of individual closed-ended questions. Inadequate aesthetic and statistic attitude scales were not developed. Both attitude dimensions were limited, accessed through in-depth interviews and specific survey questions results. What are the possible identical or similar questions wording was used in Japanese survey and in the United States for comparison. Cultural variation and pretest find indeed, however, result in alteration of a wording of some questions. Additionally, cluster analysis results produced varying groups on varying numbers of questions as a basis for many attitude scales. As a consequence of differences of scale development, data collection procedures, and time of the Japan and United States studies, statistical tests of significance were not considered as appropriate basis for comparison. Attitude towards varying wildlife conservation and management issues were not examined. Topics covered including conservation of endangered species, animal damage control, hunting, wildlife habitat destruction, and marine mammal conservation. Knowledge of animals in this study was assessed by 25 true-false questions, questions on species endangerment and extinction, bird species identification, and awareness of wildlife issues. The 25 true-false questions were used to create a knowledge of animal scale. Questions of behavioral interactions with nature covered with the following topics: national parks and zoological park revisitation, nature-related television viewing, purchase of wildlife products, pet ownership, hunting, fishing, nature photography, birdwatching, conservation organization membership, farming and livestock raising, and insect collecting. In addition to a survey of a Japanese public, in-depth interviews were conducted with 50 Japanese people regarded as possessing an extensive knowledge of Japanese attitude toward nature. This methodology primarily involved open-ended questions on a variety of broad philosophical, cultural, and historical topics. The in-depth interviews were regarded in the complement of a statistical data obtained in the closed-ended survey of the Japanese public. More than 300 people were recommended as possible in-depth interview respondents. Recommendations were obtained from scholars and government officials in Japan and the United States. Final respondent selection were based on the quality of recommendation and diversity of interest and professional background. Persons selected included scholars, scientists, government officials, conservationists, filmmakers, religious figures, journals, foresters, wildlife managers. 2 bilingual Japanese research assistants assisted in the in-depth interviews. The following topics were covered in the in-depth interviews, like that. This is Japanese appreciation and concern for nature, attitudes toward population and its control, attitudes toward the conservation of wildlife and biological diversity, conflicts between economic development and conservation, historical shifts in Japanese attitudes toward nature, the meaning and importance of Japanese traditions such as rock gardening, flower arranging, the tea ceremony, bonsai, haiku, etc., the meaning and influence of Shinto and Buddhism on Japanese attitude toward nature, attitudes toward plant versus animals, nature-related television viewing and reading, and national park use and perception. What's about table? There are special basic wildlife values were used for this comparison. For example, there are several 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 terms were used to identify basic wildlife values, including term naturalistic value. This is a primary focus and interest and affection for wildlife and the outdoors. Ecological values. This is primarily concern of an environment as a system and for international interrelationships between wildlife species and natural habitats. Humanistic value. This is primarily interest in a strong affection for individual animals such as pets or large wild animals and with strong anthropomorphic associations. Moralistic value. This is primarily concern for the right and wrong treatment of animals, with strong ethical opposition to presumed over-exploitation or cruelty toward animals. The scientific value of wildlife. This is primarily interest in the physical attributes and biological functioning of animals. Aesthetical wildlife value. This is primarily interest in the physical attractiveness and symbolic characteristics of animals. There is utilitarian consumption wildlife value. This is primarily interest in the practical value of animals. There is utilitarian habitat value. This is primarily interest in the practical value of habitat associated with wild animals. There is also dominionistic wildlife value. It means this is the primary interest in the mastery and control of animals, typically in sporting situations. There is a negativistic wildlife value, which means this is primary orientation and active avoidance of animals due to dislike or fear. There is also neutralistic wildlife value. This is primarily concern of passive avoidance of animals due to lack of interest. And also there is theistic wildlife values. These are primarily orientation on fatalistic belief in wildlife as controlled by external deities or non-natural forces. So this is the first part of an article which I was reading about study of Japanese attitudes, knowledge and behavior. And I hope I will read the second part of this article in the second part of my discussion. Thank you for your interest, and the next part will be about basic attitude and knowledge results. So the first part was mostly about some methodological approaches, about initiation of the problem, and the basic attitudes and knowledge results we will discuss in the second part of my stream, where I will read the second part, or maybe I will do 2 parts more reading this very valuable article about Japanese perception of wildlife published by Stephen Keller in a conservation biology article. And if you are interested in, please stay tuned. Don't forget to be subscribed on my channel. Write your comments in discussion area. Write your thoughts about Japanese attitude to the nature and about your country's attitude to the nature. It will be very much interesting for both for me, for you, and for audience about wildlife conservation, perception, approach, and attitude. And thank you for watching. Stay tuned, stay subscribed. Please welcome to my Patreon page as well and subscribe. See you soon on my channel. The second part will come very soon. Bye bye. See you soon on my channel.